We'll start this. This, by the way, this opening slide is huh? I don't know.
Yeah, that's much
That
better.
worked? Okay, that's
Yeah,
right.
thank you.
This opening slide kind of is a caricature of how each side saw the other, you know, during the war. It serves as show how attitudes were. There's many schools of thought as to when the Cold War began. You know, some people go back to Roosevelt's administration, some people go back, but I'm gonna start with a specific event that happens in 1944, and this is when Winston Churchill goes to Moscow, meets with Stalin. There's no Americans in the room, right? So this is and this is as Churchill describes the event himself. Quote, "The moment was right for business, so I said, let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. Your armies are in Romania and Bulgaria. We have interest there. Don't let us get at cross purposes. As far as Britain and Russia are concerned, how would it do for you to have 90% predominance in Romania, for us to have 90% of the say in Greece, and go 50-50 about Yugoslavia?" While this was being translated, I wrote this out on a half sheet of paper. The handwriting is mine from Roosevelt. I pushed this across to Stalin, who then heard the translation. There was a slight pause. Then he took his blue pencil and made a large tick upon it and passed it back to us. It was all settled in no more time than it takes to write down. So, why did the Soviets get such a head start in Eastern Europe? This probably is a big part of it. So you think one of the people we regard as one of the heroes of World War II may have had a little bit to do with the start of the Cold War. So then the next thing that happens is Yalta. The Yalta Conference it took place in the Crimea. Now you see the war situation already. The big three, of course, when at the end of the conference, Roosevelt had less than 2 months to live, and each leader had an agenda. Roosevelt wanted Soviet support for the U.S. war against Japan. Specifically, assistance in the planned invasion of Japan. Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War 3 months after the defeat of Germany. Churchill pressed for election and democratic governments in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, you know how Churchill wanted to have British predominance in Greece. Churchill had one point of view, and that was the continuance of the British Empire. So if the Brits dominated in Greece, he knew that he could get a free passage along the Mediterranean by Greece through the Suez Canal to India. So that was Churchill's top priority. And Stalin, of course, demanded a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Now, can you all hear this?
A little louder,
As
please.
they were called, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill decided on how Germany would finally be defeated, divided, and punished. They planned the invasion of mainland Japan, and they agreed on their own post-war zones and influence across the globe. Not alone, of course. Armies of advisors were there to help them work it all out.
It's Henry. Let me say Henry.
You did.
The Soviet team were in the strongest position. The Red Army had been sweeping across Europe at breakneck speed. As the talks were going on, their troops were on the outskirts of Berlin, ready to take the city at any moment. The Allies, meantime, had just crossed the Rhine. There was tacit acceptance that the Soviets would have supremacy over Eastern Europe, and that each of the Allies would occupy a separate zone in Germany once the fighting was over. Berlin would be split along similar lines. Each of the big three had his own special interest in the outcome of the Yalta talks. What none of them realized at the time was that they were inadvertently setting the ground rules for the Cold War, which was to last last for another generation. Winston Churchill, who later talked about an iron curtain descending in Europe, had Britain's imperial legacy to worry about.
Now we go. And here. Go. Not bad. We'll try see if it works again. So that was the start of it, I guess. As I said, Roosevelt had 2 months to live, and by the time these 3 people try to meet again, 2 of them will be replaced. So, but you see the results of what happened. This is, you can note how what they did, they pushed Poland to the west. This is the original Poland. This is the Poland we know today. Basically giving the Soviet Union a huge buffer zone, seen in blue, of which probably the bottom half of this buffer zone is what we now call Ukraine. And so in April, the troops meet at the Elbe River. Germany surrenders. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, and here's kind of like a victorious picture on the cover of Time. So World War II is almost over. We still have to take care of Japan. We'll see the Potsdam Conference, and then we'll see the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Now the Soviets, you got to admit, the Soviets are true to their word. They came in exactly 3 months after Germany surrenders. Of course, by that point, it was kind of moot, we having dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And despite all that, the Soviets did manage to get away with a little bit of northern Japan's territory. And of course, here's a better map of Eastern Europe. And we see these are the 6 countries that fall behind what became known as the Iron Curtain. And okay, here's the Potsdam Conference, and you see here it's very vivid how Truman has already replaced Roosevelt, who died in April. During the conference, the British have an election, and notwithstanding Churchill's role in leading them through World War II, they threw out the Conservatives, and the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, becomes the Prime Minister. And here you see these are kind of the various decisions that were made at Potsdam. Many people may have forgotten that up until 1955, the country of Austria was actually divided into 4 zones of occupation. The German and Polish frontiers, as we just saw, and of course, many of the European nations, they wanted Germany to become like an agricultural country. We don't want we don't want the Germans to have any more potential for building up industry or conducting a war. And the Americans, it didn't take long before the Americans realized without Germany as the, you might say, the driving engine behind the European economy, they weren't going to proceed all that well. So there was work afoot to to resurrect Germany. Now, we'll try again, see if we can get a, no.
It's spring 1946. Winston Churchill traveled to the United States. He tried to shock Americans out of their complacency. In a speech at Fulton, Missouri,
You can't really hear that anyway.
Can't hear it?
No.
No. There we go.
Turn it up as loud as you can.
The Iron Curtain has
Along that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. So all these famous cities and the population around them lie in what I must call the Soviet steppe.
Churchill's vivid picture of a continent divided by an iron curtain helped change the public.
All right. I am sorry for the low volume. I don't quite know how to goose it up. Could most people hear that?
Yeah.
Churchill's speech?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, this, of course, it gives the rise to the, now, what are we going to do about Europe? Well, the answer was very simple. We're going to provide them with lots of money. Note the time, there was, one of the keys to this was Republican Senator Vandenberg, who Truman quickly got on board for this plan. And if you note the time difference between when Truman signs it and aid gets underway for Europe, less than 3 weeks. And of course, it really kept European, the big fear was that Europe was going to fall to communism. There were active Communist Party in every single nation in Western Europe, including Great Britain. They were particularly powerful in France and Italy. And of course, I think Marshall won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. He announced it, by the way, at a commencement at Harvard. And during the 4 years the plan was operational, we sent $15 billion in economic assistance to help recover the European countries. As a means of comparison, in today's money, that equivalent sum would be over $150 billion. Now, the Soviets are determined to stop. So here you see, this is the big decision. Can we isolate Berlin? So they put a ban on all ground transportation through these various routes from the British and the American zones, thinking that they could starve Berlin out. And already the three Western powers, U.S., Britain, and France, were needing to coordinate their efforts in Germany. And they announced that a new German Deutschmark for West Germany would begin to circulate in the three zones of West Germany. 1 week later, the Soviets shut down all surface transportation to Berlin.
On June the 30th, 1948, the Allied powers began a massive airlift into the city of Berlin. It was their answer to a road and rail blockade set up by the Soviet Union 2 months earlier, and it shook the world by its daring and effectiveness. As part of the post-war settlement, the former German capital had been divided into 4 sections. British, American, and French were the western areas, the Soviet occupied the east. But Berlin itself was inside Soviet-occupied territory, which meant that all food supplies and any other kind of material needed to keep life going had to pass through their checkpoints before it could reach the Allied zones. The blockade was an effort to drive the West out of the city. The airlift was to make sure it could survive. Routes of supplies on 895 flights. In the end, with the shops still full despite all the Soviet efforts to empty them, Moscow backed down. In a deal arranged at the United Nations, 2 Germanies were established. The German Democratic Republic was set up in the east, the Federal German Republic in the west. Berlin itself
some of the statistics of the population of Berlin. I think if you add Boston, Cambridge, and Worcester, you've got the total population of what was then Berlin. Note the statistics here. And what they did was they wanted to prove, by the way, a good majority of the material delivered into Berlin was coal, because their electric system, everything depended, the coal for their home fireplaces, everything depended on coal. They called it the Easter Parade on April 16th. When it was over, 13,000 tons of coal had been delivered. And they got so efficient that they were having takeoffs coming through Tempelhof Airport about every 45 seconds. That's how effective and how efficient the airlift got to be. When the Soviets lifted the blockade in May, the airlift continued. It continued for another 2 months, until 3 months worth of supplies had been stored in West Berlin in case the Soviets decided we're going to do this again. So we built up, the Allies built up a reserve supply of both coal and food that would keep Berlin going. And finally, in August, West Germany would come into being as a fully sovereign country. So now that's the summer of 1949. And another big event happens in the fall, the fall of China. This map shows the general progress of the communist forces gradually taking over. By 1948, the communists are slowly advancing everywhere. The nationalist regime of China slowly lost ground. The corrupt nature of Chiang Kai-shek's regime compared to the humble origins of Mao's peasants and workers' army was a big contributing factor to the erosion of support. Now, there was what they called the China lobby. These were senators and congressmen in the United States Congress that really supported Chiang Kai-shek and everything he did. The people in the State Department, the people who were on site, knew how corrupt Chiang was. But to the people who continued to say, you know, we've got to get rid of this guy, they would pay for it very shortly, because when the McCarthy era starts in the early 1950s, these people will look as possible communist sympathizers, only because what they had done was warn as to how corrupt Chiang Kai-shek's regime was. So the next section, because we lose our monopoly in the atomic bomb in 1949, then you will see the next big events take place in this period here, where confrontation really takes off. And so by the start of 1950, the world is quickly divided into two opposing groups. So shortly around the time that this is the NSC, National Security Council Document 68, which was put together largely by Paul Nitzer. It was 54 pages long and contained 3 premises. It said that, number 1, the Soviets are intent on world domination. Number 2, they presently possess a large military superiority in traditional forces. And due to these 2 points, negotiations with Soviet leadership would be useless. Now, initially, Truman didn't support this, but once he digested it, you would see where the defense budgets in fiscal year 50, the defense budget was $13 billion. In fiscal 51, 22. In fiscal year 53, the defense budget was $50 billion. Now, I never converted that to current dollars, but you have to figure it would be a pretty significant amount. And of course, the impetus for most of that comes from the next event. The Soviet invasion, the invasion by North Korea into South Korea. And really the war contained 5 different phases. The first 4 of which would take place within a calendar year. Very beginning, the Koreans surge across the thing, and very shortly thereafter, we are confined to the Pusan perimeter in the southeast corner of Japan. It's not looking good. MacArthur engineers an amphibious landing in Incheon, right next to Seoul. And it doesn't take long that we have driven the North Korean forces almost back to the Yalu River. The Yalu River is the border between North Korea and China. In November, now it's only been, 4 months since the start of the war, Chinese troops reinforced their allies. And U.S. and Korean troops retreat back to a defensive line across the peninsula, which will pretty much remain a stalemate for the next 3 years. Before the Chinese intervention, Truman would fly to Wake Island and to meet with General MacArthur. MacArthur assured Truman, well, we do not have to worry about the Chinese invasion. MacArthur wants to bomb Chinese factories and support points on the other side of the Yalu River in Chinese territory. Truman, who was facing elections, tended to defer quite a different tone.
The Truman administration now favors a limited war, one that can lead the enemy back to a position from which peace talks can begin. General Douglas MacArthur, however, has his own foreign policy. There's no substitute for victory, he says, and that means all-out war with China. Despite warnings from the president himself, MacArthur continues to vent his frustration, loudly and often. Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon refuse to yield to MacArthur and his Republican supporters in Congress. MacArthur infuriates Truman with his continued interference and pronouncements.
He thought he was running a better government in Japan than you were running a better government in Washington. Was one of his greatest punchlines that he would always put in private conversation.
Rumors of political ambitions on the general's part only make the situation worse. A young aide on MacArthur's staff is Lieutenant Alexander Haig.
MacArthur, as a result of it, began increasing his service as a potential Republican candidate for president. Let me tell you from first-hand experience, when presidents suspect they have competition, they take care of it. They're heading over.
MacArthur steadfastly has refused to accept any responsibility for the sudden turn in Korea, while publicly blaming Washington. Truman says, I could no longer tolerate his insubordination. MacArthur is out.
Do you have the actual message that Truman said?
Well, MacArthur wanted to resign, right? And Truman said, he is not going to I'm going to fire him before he resigns. That was Truman's intent.
Yeah, Truman said, I think this is a quote, I didn't fire him because he's a dumb son of a bitch. I fired him because he wouldn't follow the orders of the president. No, I fired him because he wouldn't follow the orders of the president. I did not fire him because he's a dumb son of a bitch, which he is, but if that were grounds for firing him, we'd have to get rid of almost all the generals and
Sounds like Harry.
yeah.
Excuse me, John request, because it came in late,
Oh, yeah,
interrupt, he said, hold all
You got
comments
it.
and questions
No,
until
I
the end.
appreciate it, yeah,
Thank you.
apologies.
it ruins my flow.
So,
Okay. February 28th. Stalin loved watching American movies. So he has a movie night with Lavrenti Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, and Nikita Khrushchev, where he retires to his bedroom to sleep. At dawn, Stalin did not emerge from his room. Although his guards thought it was odd for him not to rise at the usual time, they were under strict orders not to disturb him. At around 10 p.m., he was discovered by the deputy commandant, who entered his bedroom to check up on him, and recalled the scene of Stalin lying on his back on the floor of his room beside his bed, wearing pajama bottoms and clothes soaked in stale urine. He used the bedroom telephone, where he frantically called some party officials telling them Stalin may have had a stroke, and asked them to send good doctors to the residence immediately. Lavrenti Beria was informed, and Lavrenti Beria is head of the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB. And so the doctors arrived in the morning of 2nd March, and Stalin dies on 5 March, and was embalmed on 9 March. Officially, Stalin died naturally due to cerebral hemorrhage. In 2003, a joint group of Russian and American historians announced their opinion that Stalin had ingested warfarin, a powerful, tasteless poison which predisposes the victim to a cerebral hemorrhage. Both Beria and Khrushchev were in a position to add the warfarin to Stalin's wine the evening before. It was believed that Stalin felt Beria's power was too great and threatened his own. The memoirs of Molotov, published in 1993, claimed that Beria had boasted to Molotov that he poisoned Stalin. Quote, "I took him out." Beria didn't enjoy his success very long. On 26 June, Beria was arrested. Khrushchev prepares an ambush, convening a meeting in the Presidium, where he suddenly launched a scathing attack on Beria. When Beria finally realized what was happening, he appealed to Malenkov, an old friend, to speak for him. Malenkov nodded and silently pressed a button on his desk. This was an arranged signal for Marshal Zhukov and a group of armed officers nearby, who burst in and arrested Beria. He was held for 6 months and then executed by a shot to the head on December 23rd. So that takes care of the Soviet Union. Now, this kind of gives you an idea. By the middle of the 1950s, you see that we're coming into notice by the way, the NATO was founded in 1949 with the nations in blue. West Germany joins on May 55. 5 days later, you see the Warsaw Pact being formed. France would be a little bit of a trouble, and they withdrew. But note the proximity between those two dates, which brings to mind one of our next major players, Nikita Khrushchev. You see here some of his resume. He led the Soviet Union during a large part of the Cold War from 1953 to 1964. He was responsible for the de-Stalinization. Now, in 1956, he appears before the Soviet Congress and reads what they call the secret letter, which was never released to the West. But what he was doing was defining how bad Stalin's rule was, how people would be taken in the middle of the night. And in other words, he was kind of uncovering the lid off of the way Stalin had ruled. So in the middle of the 50s, we both have problems. A little play on words here. The Soviet satellites wouldn't stay down. Our satellites wouldn't go up. And here you see the Soviet revolt first in Poland, and then in Hungary. And you see how, and I remember being, so I would have been 11, and wondering, how come we're not helping the Hungarians? How come we're not doing something here? This is the age of 11. But after some debate, the Presidium on 30 October decided not to remove the new Hungarian government. Even Marshal Zhukov said we should withdraw troops from Budapest and, if necessary, withdraw from Hungary as a whole. For a brief moment, it looked as if there might have been a peaceful solution. The next day, the Soviet leaders met again and decided to reverse their decision from the previous day. Some historians believe that Hungary's pending declaration to exit the Warsaw Pact would trigger the Soviet intervention. Mind you.
At dawn on November 4, 1956, 1,000 Soviet tanks swept into the center of Budapest to put down a revolt that had brought hope, freedom, and a new style of government to the people of Hungary. The rise against Soviet rule had begun some weeks earlier. Ordinary citizens had taken up arms to fight the occupying forces in a bid to free themselves from Moscow's domination. A government at home that was as oppressive as its Soviet neighbors. For the first time since the communist takeover at the end of the Second World War, the Hungarian national flag was openly on display. Partisans were joined by elements of the Hungarian army, and when they weren't fighting alongside, the soldiers often handed over their weapons to the new revolutionaries, even tanks. The Hungarian government was forced to start negotiations for the withdrawal of Soviet troops and began to admit publicly that it had made serious mistakes in the past. Democratization would begin at once. Prime Minister Imre Nagy also promised to reform the political system to allow all democratic forces on the broadest basis. No one in Moscow was going to allow that. Even as a Hungarian general was negotiating the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Budapest, plans for a full-scale attack on the rebels were being drawn up in Moscow. The velvet glove was about to be removed from the iron fist.
Meanwhile, when I said our satellites would go up, those of you who may remember the much heralded, televised initial launches of our satellites, several of which really didn't go very well. Finally, we get to launch, and of course, when we finally get a little satellite beeping around the world, the Soviets immediately launched a huge Sputnik 3. Now, but when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, you know, the United States becomes immediately concerned, and here's why. This is the path of the original Sputnik. As you can see, it traverses over American territory several times, and this illustrates the concern felt by the U.S. after the launch of the first Sputnik. It's easy to see why the event caused a shock in the United States. The reasoning was if the Soviets could put a small beeping satellite directly over the United States, what would prevent them from putting a larger satellite containing weapons in the same orbit? So the impacts on many aspects of American life, particularly in defense and education, would be felt for the next decade and would prompt both a space race and an arms race. So, now we see, this is where the confrontation really begins to take off. And of course, this is probably one or two significant events during this 5-year period. We will see that with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets realized that in matters of the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. was not prepared to back down any further. We see Castro takes over in Cuba. He originally had tried to take it over in 1953. He was captured, tried, and sentenced to prison. He comes out of prison in 1957, and goodness, was that somebody else?
No, that was Steve.
Steve,
You okay?
Okay. He was sworn in as Prime Minister of Cuba. He attends the UN in 1960 and becomes very good buddies with Khrushchev. He offended by the attitude of his hotel. His entourage stayed in the impoverished area of Harlem. He was also visited by Khrushchev, the two leaders publicly highlighting the poverty faced by U.S. citizens in areas like Harlem. Castro described New York City as a city of persecution against black and poor Americans. Now, also in the summer of 1960, Eisenhower wants to have one last summit, so he plans for a summit in Paris. And what happens is Francis Gary Powers, the pilot of the U-2, takes off and never reaches its destination. So NASA says, well, we think the plane may have, now, of course, by the way, Francis Gary Powers had a suicide pellet. He was supposed to, if you're captured, Mr. Powers, you're supposed to take this. Didn't quite do that. So here we have Khrushchev broadcasting, not only do we have the plane, we have the pilot. So Eisenhower makes it to Paris on May 15th, and the summit quickly collapses. The attempt was a failure, and so nothing, and the funny part of it is, this was probably one of the last scheduled flights of the U-2. They had already decided to phase it out because we had sufficient satellite coverage that the U-2s wouldn't be needed anymore. So John F. Kennedy is elected in 1960, and in 1961 we have his meeting in Vienna. Now, of course, Kennedy already has been chastened because of the events of April '61, the failure of the Bay of Pigs, and of course, and this is what they're talking about. And in case anybody is interested, these two chairs are currently on display at the Kennedy Library in Columbia Point. And JFK said, his comment was, he beat the hell out of me. And Khrushchev, his comment was, Kennedy looks not only anxious but deeply upset. I hadn't meant to upset him. I would have liked very much for us to part in a different mood, but there was nothing I could do to help him. Politics is a merciless business. Now, if you remember, in the meantime, we were finally, oops, I'm missing a very key event here. The Berlin Wall.
this isn't late, this is...
Go home. Along the border, East Berliners are forced to evacuate their homes as the communist police move to prevent their escape.
Some pretty dramatic footage here. Apologize for the loud music.
In the hands of East German police, and water hoses are played on equipment. Nevertheless, our reporters are able to come up with a remarkable picture, despite
That's not like broken hip.
Heedless of danger,
Hey,
from
Lisa.
the
Fifth floor window.
permitting hatchway open to escape state flee. This woman drops into a net held by others with firemen. And then, as the tense crowd watches, she is followed by her husband. First, he throws out a few prized possessions. Determined to protect their people from such temptation, the East Germans are raising homes and buildings along the border and creating a 10-foot ditch to prevent autos and trucks from smashing the barrier.
Missile crisis. And as a way of seeing why it was such a problem, we see Soviets, they have different missile ranges, and of course they have short, intermediate, and long. And there's not much that the long-range missiles and even the intermediate-range missiles manage to cover quite a bit. Now, it would be informative here to show a similar map portraying the extent to which Jupiter missiles, which we had in Turkey, would cover the Soviet Union. While it was not revealed at the time, Kennedy says to Khrushchev, we will remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey as a offset to the missiles that you are taking out of Cuba. But this wasn't revealed until well after the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. Here we have part one of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The sites are spotted by U-2 planes, by the way. One U-2 plane flying over Cuba was shot down, and the executive committee meets with Kennedy, and they are considering three possible solutions. So what happens is, meanwhile, there's a little backstairs communication going on with the Soviets. We get the first U-2 photographic image on October 14th. On October 18th, President Kennedy meets with the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko. Okay, you want to pay particular attention.
Offensive weapons be turned back. Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
And there you have the crux of the matter. We'll consider if you attack us from Cuba, it's coming from the Soviet Union, we will respond accordingly. And I remember watching the president at home. I was 17 at the time. I grew up in Maine. And I remember sitting on the sofa with my mother, and I'm wondering, I wonder if Portland, Maine is important enough for them to waste a missile on. I'm 17, you know. And I'm sure you all may have your own individual memories of watching this speech and considering what it might evolve into. Anyway, here we see the behind-the-scenes negotiation, and I did have another small tape, which I'm not running. Soviet Ambassador Stevenson is at the UN, and the Russian ambassador says, "We will provide you with evidence." And Stevens says, "I am prepared to wait for that evidence until hell freezes over." And of course, again, as long as we say we will not physically invade Cuba, Bobby Kennedy met with Dobrynin, and the crisis ended. Dobrynin was the U.S. The Soviet ambassador to the U.S. for about 24 years, and he wrote a book in '95 which provides a lot of material on that. One good product that comes out of the confrontation is this: direct communication between the Pentagon and the Soviet military establishment. And it became operational on August 30th, 1963 by transmitting the first test messages. The next use of the hotline was in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when both superpowers kept each other informed of military moves. The main concern at hand was the close proximity of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet and the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, and how to prevent possible misunderstandings. I was actually in the Med during that period, and we had frequent encounters with Soviet naval ships. I remember at one point my commander, he signaled the Soviet commanding officer, "Would you like to come over for breakfast?" And the Soviet guy signaled back, "Maybe some other time." But it was there were a bunch of well-armed Navy ships from both sides operating in the Med. Okay, so now we go to phase 4. We may not get through all this, but we'll try. The period began with changes in leadership in the United States and the Soviet Union within a 12-month period. Following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, at which Johnson said, for all I know, they might have been shooting at whales up there. And then we'll see the Soviet intervention again in Czechoslovakia. And finally, Nixon goes to China. And when I say the end of a bipolar world, what it means is by the end of this period, there are really now 3 major powers that have to be taken into consideration. But Nixon's intent was, if I talk directly with China, I could drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China. There's no need to reprise the events of November 22nd. Very well remembered by all of us. Johnson takes the oath on board Air Force One, and the Soviet people were particularly touched. They had, formed kind of a liking for Kennedy, because they saw him as a person who did not really want war. So now we have turned over the Kremlin. And a lot of this stems from Khrushchev, their perception of Khrushchev as having backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was kind of a repeat, because they call a Presidium meeting, and led by Brezhnev, they struck on October '64 while Khrushchev was on vacation. Brezhnev calls Khrushchev to inform him of a special Presidium meeting. Khrushchev suspected the real reason for the meeting, but flew to Moscow anyway. Khrushchev put up little resistance, and that night called his friend and told him, this is a quote from Khrushchev, "I'm old and tired. Let them cope by themselves. I've done the main thing. Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now everything is different. The fear is gone, and we can talk as equals. That's my contribution. So within the space of 1 year, we have replacements at the top of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which brings the next main character, Leonid Brezhnev, whose tenure as head of the Soviet Union was the second only to Stalin. He masterminded Khrushchev's ouster, voted in, and he pushed policies for détente. But note this. He was not probably the brightest bulb on the string by the late 70s, but he remained in power because nobody wanted to take the initiative to replace Brezhnev. Now, each of us has allies. Each of us has key allies. And the trouble with allies is you can't always know what they're going to do. Each of us had one key ally that we'd already discussed, Mao. This gentleman here, called on by his country to form a government in 1958, de Gaulle inspired a new constitution and was the Fifth Republic's first president. He strongly identified with his nation, so much that for many he personified France. France continued to pursue a more independent foreign policy, sometimes at odds with that of the United States, in large measure due to de Gaulle's legacy. But events will again, the Prague Spring, again, now we're talking about the summer of 1968. The Warsaw Pacts, the Soviets are hoping that the Czechs will get the message when they kind of begin to form Warsaw Pact arms all the way around. On August 3rd, representatives from the USSR, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and East Germany meet with the Czech leaders and sign a declaration which affirms unshakable loyalty to Marxist-Leninism. On the night of 20-21 August, Eastern Bloc armies from 4 Warsaw Pact countries invade Czechoslovakia. Now this will be a tough one because I have 3 segments, but I think I can work it. I'm getting so good at this now.
In Czechoslovakia, the reformers were confident that they could bring communism up to date. The party would still lead, but by consent, not force. There would be freedom to speak and write, to travel and organize. There would even be a form of market economy. Dubček's vision was named Socialism with a Human Face. One of the first changes was the ending of censorship. Suddenly the papers were full of truth. Since Slovak in the Cold War.
The imposition of censorship took us openly anti-communist, anti-Soviet publications and articles that started to appear.
This is the Soviet ambassador.
2 days later, the Czechoslovak leaders made some concessions, but it was too late. The Soviet Politburo had already decided to solve the problem by force.
Film message. But instead, the door suddenly opened and paratroopers came in, carrying Kalashnikovs. They stood behind us and the commander said they were taking us under protection in the name of the forces of the Warsaw Pact. What will happen later, we'll see. We were prisoners.
Czechoslovakia's kidnapped leaders decided resistance was hopeless. In a tragic broadcast,
It's 11:01. Should people want to leave?
The Czechoslovak experiment, the most daring attempt to marry communism with democracy, had failed.
Which leads to what they called the Brezhnev Doctrine. It's kind of a little like Roche Motel. Once you go in, you can never leave. Once a country converts to socialism, we will not allow them to go back from socialism. And this really is the way it was stated in the Soviet press. Now, this is one point where I might just get a little bit of feedback. And you might see a pattern here.
Every 4 years.
Every 4 years, yeah.
Or October, no.
The presidential election.
Bingo! The Soviets felt unnerved to make, when is a good time to make a significant move? Well, let's see now. During the year of presidential elections would probably be a pretty good chance. Now, full confession, that's my own theory. However, I don't know if you believe in coincidences, maybe there is something to it. Now, Nixon goes to China. Now, Nixon had originally been elected to Congress on a strict anti-communist platform. He ran against an incumbent congresswoman. He called her the Pink Lady. And that's how he first got elected to Congress. He and Kennedy were both elected to the Senate in 1952. But again, they say that Nixon started to plan this from the very first day of his administration. And and it does work out.
From Nixon's wife was allowed off the plane until after the first presidential handshake. Yes, it was a triumph. Nixon was even taken to meet Mao himself. In fact, the alien despot insisted on it.
2月21日下午，毛泽东主席
According to the testimony of his doctor, Mao was beside himself with excitement on the day of Nixon's arrival. The president of the free world, a socially inept man at the best of times, was intensely nervous about his tete-a-tete with the Red Emperor. So much so that he made notes to remind himself how to behave. Treat him as emperor. Don't quarrel. Don't praise him too much. Praise the people, old, ancient. Praise poems. Love of country. You don't know me, Nixon opened and inadvertently sounding once again like a salesman. But anything I say, I deliver.
Resigns, the attitude of the Soviets was very, very interesting. In other words, you know, for this, he had to resign? And this is, again, this is a quote from the former ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The rather than relive the entire Vietnam War, we'll just cut to the chase, the end here. I did have a video of the famous helicopter flights out of Saigon, but this shows you how quickly that when we're relying on a native army to fight for us, how quickly that native army might fold and surrender. Have we seen this movie again? Yeah. So, there is some cooperation in space. I think this is the one and only fight we made between the two. 3 astronauts, 2 cosmonauts. So this was a little bit, and Brezhnev is trying to get a little bit of daytime going. And of course, now the third party has a change in leadership. Shift the page here. The Helsinki Accords was signed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Soviets wanted above all, remember the slide we looked at in Poland, that they wanted above all to get those Soviet and Polish borders approved by the West. In order to do that, they were willing to give up on quite a few things to open up their country. But what happens is they thought that getting the West to sign off on the Russian and Polish borders was worth any other concession they may make. New leaders in China, when Zhou Enlai dies, it takes a while, but they're very unsettled, and as you can see, the distance between these two events, it takes a while for the leadership of the Chinese People's Republic to decide on a leader. Once they did, of course, the pace could proceed more quickly. New actors take the stage. A very good book called The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister. Here are the 3 people. We see Pope John Paul takes office in 1978. The Shah of Iran deposed, which will lead to the entire hostage crisis. Then the Soviets had their own quagmire. Now, between 1975 and 1980, the U.S. was kind of suffering from what a lot of people call Vietnam syndrome. We had been so badly defeated, we didn't really feel like we should have tried anything. So we tended to back off. We'll see and finally in the fall of 1983, a pair of incidents will bring the threat of nuclear confrontation to a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Pope John Paul II, my wife was always convinced that when John Paul I died after 1 month, that was God's way of saying, wrong choice, try again. He was acclaimed as one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century, and he was credited to helping end communist rule. And you can see, when he arrives in Poland, his arrival alone was sufficient to trigger a lot of resistance on the part of the Poles. And he was criticized for upholding the church's teaching in some ways. Now we have the Iranian hostage crisis. Again, we have events like this that alone could be 3, 4, 5 slides. Since this is kind of a survey, I elected to cover the whole thing in 1 slide. When the Shah dies in Egypt, Carter's inability, despite this attempt, Carter's inability to resolve the hostage crisis was probably a major factor in Reagan defeating him in 1980. In the United States, again, Now it's time the Soviets have their own quagmire. And you see here the one member of the Politburo said, you know, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Soviets went ahead and did it anyway. The first phase begins with the Soviet intervention. Soviet troops found themselves drawn into fighting against tribal uprisings and tribal armies, and sometimes against mutinying Afghan army units, which just goes to show you, you just don't want to mess around with Afghanistan. The Brits had to learn it, the Soviets had to learn it, and we finally had to learn it. But if you look at the picture in 1980, you could see that the Soviets could feel, gee, we really are a bit surrounded. Now it's interesting that in this particular picture, they're regarding China as a threat to the Soviet Union. But if you look at all these others, and you see all the different directions from which the Soviets say we could be threatened, you can see why the Soviets might have developed a bit of paranoia. And of course, this probably didn't help either.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, but because these quiet men do not raise their voices, because they sometimes speak in soothing tones of brotherhood and peace, because like other dictators before them, they're always making their final territorial demand, some would have us accept them at their word and accommodate ourselves to their aggressive impulse. The United States in a position of best efforts for those in the church. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, labelable equally occult, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state,
this was, again, I quote Mr. Dobrinin several times. This was, at the time of the speech, what the Soviets said, and this is with the benefit of hindsight from Ambassador Dobrinin. Really the contrast, you know, they say Reagan brought the world to the brink and then was able to pull it back from the brink. And now, at this point in time, I have the next three pictures I thought I'd put together on one slide because they really portray an image. And I thought Reagan's comment was kind of spot on.
I forgot him.
You know, what can you say? I couldn't resist putting those. Now, here was the first crisis of the year of 1983, Korean Airlines. It was apparently it was a human error right here. This was it was supposed to fly into Seoul, the Korean Airlines. The crew failed to put the autopilot system in the correct mode. The result that it flew over the Soviet territory of Kamchatka. Now at this time, simultaneously, the United States had been making surveillance flights over Russian territory. And so the Soviets felt justified in shooting that down. But only 9 weeks after that flight was shot down came another moment in the Cold War when the world might have been even closer to nuclear war than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many people have ever heard of this? Operation Able Archer. Okay? It was a 10-day NATO exercise starting in November 1983 that spanned Western Europe. It simulated a period of conflict escalation culminating in a coordinated nuclear attack. The exercise incorporated a new, unique form of coded communications, participation by heads of government, and a simulated DEFCON 1 nuclear alert. The realistic nature of this 1983 exercise, coupled with deteriorating relations between the U.S. and the USSR, and the anticipated arrival of Pershing nuclear missiles in Europe, led some members of the Soviet Politburo and military to believe that Able Archer 83 was a ruse of war, obscuring preparations for a nuclear first strike. In response, the Soviets readied their nuclear forces and placed air units in East Germany and Poland on alert. It is considered by many historians to be the closest the world has come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it ended with the ending of the exercise. So, here we see, I've got 2 more sections. I'll hurry as best I can. Well, we see Gorbachev will take over, and at the end of this session, we'll see how the third major power in the world will violently suppress its own people's desire for more freedom. And then, so, again, Mikhail Gorbachev, the third biography. He was well educated. He was widely traveled. He'd been exposed to the West. In 1984, I think he meets with Margaret Thatcher, and Thatcher's comment, "This is a man we can do business with." And of course, he's taking over after a quick succession of 3 Soviet deaths. He has his first summit with Reagan in 1985, and this will rapidly become a big issue. The U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative, which the movie had already come out, was known as Star Wars. However, these 2 men formed a relationship which will become very evident when we get to the last slide. The next session starts with arguments about the arms race.
It's a token. Can that go up a little louder?
No, no.
That's the highest.
It's a better control.
The Tipsides enter the house and move to their places around a table in a small room. If Schultz and Reagan expected only a moment for a meeting with a casual agenda, Mikhail Gorbachev quickly surprises them.
Because Gorbachev comes with a full set of proposals which says, I think we should cut all our missiles in half immediately. Every missile we have, we'll cut those quantities in half. And of course, this takes Reagan and Schultz completely by surprise. And of course, whoop. Come on, you. So, then of course comes Reagan's most famous speech in Berlin.
Now,
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At a later summit, you see Reagan and Gorbachev signing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it was the first real achievement of any kind of reduction in weaponry by either side. Finally, the Soviets realized that they weren't going to do very well in Afghanistan. It seems to take a long time for people to realize that. But again, the last Soviet troops leave. I did have a Soviet video that says, well, we lost 15,000 killed, 60,000 wounded, but the troops.
The moment came which has intrigued you and fascinated. Stand there, you're looking down, there's tanks coming out. It's got its gun up, and this man just went out and he said stop. It's an absolute extraordinary. During this time, I'm thinking, this guy is going to be killed any moment now. You could look at him as unusually brave.
The tank did not try to just run him over. It turned to go around him.
That's away from me.
And then the tank turns the other way and the engine jumps the other side. They did this a couple of times, and then the tank turned on its motor.
Tanks are ready to go in the
It seemed to me
form.
that all the tanks turned off their motors because it was really quiet.
He climbed a tunnel, banged on the lid, said, get out of my city. Do not want to be. We don't know exactly what he said, but it's clear that's what he wanted to say.
Okay, see if we can. Right. Long story short, they remove.
Good.
They removed the barrier
Bill.
from. They removed. What happened was
I
they
find
opened,
out
they opened
eventually.
this avenue here.
He doesn't need it.
The
It's a
since
miracle.
people were allowed to immigrate anywhere behind the Iron Curtain, they immigrated to Hungary and they started crossing over into the border in Austria. And it didn't take long. It was kind of a domino effect, only in reverse. It was one after another. The Soviet states liberalized. We see a series of events. They begin to have Monday demonstrations in East Germany, each one. And on October 5th, and you see the East Germans are fleeing to Austria because they can. And probably the last piece that I'll show you in order to run a couple of minutes over would be that. One more minute.
Of September, the thousands of refugees living at the embassy were free. The East German government finally agreed they could emigrate on special trains to West Germany. In East Germany itself, anti-government protesters were in the streets, demanding more political freedom. On October 6th, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in East Berlin to push the hardline East German leader Erich Honecker to accept reforms. Less than 2 weeks after Gorbachev's visit, he resigned, citing health reasons. On November 8, 1989, the Berlin Wall still looked as impenetrable as it had for decades. But on November 9th, it unexpectedly cracked wide open. An East German ruling party official, Günter Schabowski, announced in a live broadcast that all rules for traveling abroad had been lifted.
Also Genossen, hier sind wir also mitgeteilt worden, dass wir eine solche Mitteilung heute schon verbreitet worden ist. Sie müsste eigentlich in Besitz sein. Das wird nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
And what it boils down to, as a matter of fact, is one German word. They said, when will this become effective? And he pauses for a minute, and he says, sofort, meaning immediately. He didn't quite know what to say, so he uses the word sofort, immediately. That was all it took. In short order, we see Germany will be reunified, and we had to convince the English and the French that it would be okay to have a reunified Germany. And it gets a little more violent in Romania, but so 2 more slides. Here we see what is now, after an attempted coup to remove Gorbachev, it's, as you can see, the component states of the Soviet Union are evaporating. The Soviet Union is failing to exist. And, all right, one last video and we're done. Thank you for your patience.
Humiliated by Yeltsin, and at last realizing that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's role was finished, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary. At Minsk, on December the 8th, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the 3 Slav states, acted to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up instead a Commonwealth of independent states. The Soviet Union was finished, and so was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev urges anyone to end the Cold War. He called Bush and told him this was his last day in office.
There was a kind of sadness
In Washington, Bush made his trip.
And of course, here you see what has bothered Vladimir Putin ever since the slow expansion of NATO coming closer and closer to the Russian borders. Now you can see where, okay, they're pretty much edging in on this. And it goes, this now is the key issue. Because if this were by some chance to become part of NATO, you could see where the Russians would feel we've kind of completely lost the old empire. And on the last slide kind of summarizes the three important people and the relationships between two of them. Six minutes over. There you have it.